Welcome to another episode of Unscripted and Unchained RPG Review. I am DM Bloodworth, and as you can see by the graphics, today I'm going to be doing something very new for my channel. I've never done a review of a gameplay supplement, and since this has been a very hot topic in gaming forums and on Twitter and such, I'm going to take a look at Consent in Gaming by Sean K. Reynolds and Shanna Germain. This was put out by Monte Cook Games as kind of a guide for GMs and player groups on how to handle the issue of consent in gaming. Now, to give you a little bit of background on my own knowledge of Monte Cook Games. I'm not familiar with any of their recent games. I've obviously heard the name Monte Cook before. He was, one of the main authors of D&D Third Edition, as well as going, quite a ways back. So he's a very well-known games designer and author, and so bearing that in mind. I also don't want to kind of weight this in a sense that, well, because it's from Monte Cook, then it must be either true or the best way to do something. And the inverse is also true. If you're not a big fan of Monte Cook for whatever reason, then you shouldn't really look at this as being something that is particularly negative. So when this first came up, and I first started hearing, or reading some comments about it before I had actually dug in and read it myself, I could already see that it was rapidly becoming a very controversial issue. And there was clearly two camps. One was saying that it was much needed, and then the other was saying that it was completely unnecessary. And as both sides went back and forth, and I eventually, after I've read it, I eventually kind of came to my own conclusion with it. And that's what I'm going to go into. But what I want to do, and I haven't seen anybody else actually do this, is I don't want to just say whether I agree with it or disagree with it. I want to go through and point out my thought process and what I saw in the actual, literature of it, and say this is what I read, this is how I took it, and this is why I either like it or I dislike it, and perhaps come up with a different approach at the end and say, well, maybe this would be a better way of doing it. Now, I know some people are going to say, well, who the hell is DM Bloodworth to be looking at, something produced by Monte Cook Games and saying, well, this is how he would do it. And, quite frankly, that's what opinions are. Is, people look at things and they say, this is how I would have done it. And so you can either take my opinion or leave it, as you choose. So I'm going to jump right in and start taking a look at it. And I am going to go section by section on it and switch here and come here. So I brought up the PDF and, consenting in games, and we start strolling down. And here we go. So I highlighted the sections that I want to focus on, and I'm assuming that this will be clear for you to read as well. So, and I'm going to read out these highlighted sections. So role-playing games allow you to explore and experience things that you'd never want to deal with in real life, or approach topics from perspective of characters who may be very different than your actual self. Playing RPGs is a shared experience that is supposed to be fun for everyone involved. And part of that is making sure that everyone in the game has consented to the premise and expectations of the campaign and the game genre. Now, I mean, it's hard to argue against that. It's, obviously we're playing characters that are, in theory, supposed to be very different from ourselves. And they're going to be exposed to things that, we wouldn't necessarily want ourselves to be exposed to. And when it gets to the point where it's saying we're making sure that everybody in the game has consented to the premise and expectations, that is what session zero is supposed to be. But in the absence of a session zero, like say you're picking up a pug group, which is really a pug group stands for a pickup group of players you've never played, with them before. It's online, and you're just saying like, hey, come one, come all, and we'll sit down. And once we get a group of five, five individuals, five players, and one GM, and we're going to run this adventure. And this is the game system that we're going to use. This is the genre of the game. This is the level of the game. You might want to put a rating on it and say, well, this game is going to be for mature audiences. You could use the movie rating system, which this document actually supports as a good idea to do, because everybody's very familiar with that. And that's all good practice, to have it very front loaded and open, and, coming out there and saying, this is what you can expect if you choose to sit down at this game. Now, that last part that I just say, if you choose to sit down at this game, does not come up in this article. And that is the very first flaw in what this is actually saying. So, and I will touch on that again. Many RPGs put characters in life or death situations, emotional conflict, and intensity with other people, or traumatic or unhealthy environments. This might Things you might avoid or deflect if you were directed at you personally. By playing a character instead of yourself, it gives you the safe emotional distance to think about and deal with those situations. Now, they say this, but then they go and the authors suggest that you disregard that distance, that they're acknowledging here. And they say, well, even though the player is supposed to, be creating this distance, this emotional distance between themselves and their character, it then turns around and puts the onus on the GM to create that distance by omitting anything. And I will get to that as well. So that's really the second flaw that I come across in this. You decide what's safe for you, and that's a given. Anybody is going to make that decision and say, you know what, when I'm looking at this and I'm looking at this genre and I'm looking at some of those points, those thematic points that you're warning me is going to be in this game or could be in this game session, I have decided that I am not going to engage in this. That's the proper response. That's the proper way this should be handled. But again, it is not explained in this guide for consent. Even if the GM is really excited about a particular idea for a game, that doesn't mean you have to accept it. True. Even if the other players are really enthusiastic about an idea, that doesn't mean that you have to accept it. That is also true. Going along with the game idea you're not comfortable with, and if they try and if they try to convince you that's a sign of poor respect, a lack of trust in the game table, all right, that might be true as well. But the answer to this is, then don't sit down at that table for that session, for that game, whatever. They're telling you you don't have to, so then don't. They go into the default answer is no, but more likely, someone at the table will add something to the game that is unexpectedly difficult. It is always okay to say no after something is introduced, even if it wasn't talked about ahead of time. And I agree with that as well. Yes, something might be introduced that, a player suddenly realizes, hey, I wasn't comfortable with this, or I'm not comfortable with this, and they can step away. It doesn't matter why the consent wasn't given. The default is that you don't have to and aren't going to talk about it. Now, I have somewhat of a problem with this, is that, and it ties into the process that the GM is supposed to use when these objections come up, is that, a player is sitting there and the GM and the other players are going through this particular scenario, a portion of the story of the adventure, and all of a sudden one of the players objects to something, and they're either tapping on an X card, or they're raising their hand, or they're giving some kind of a cue that they are not comfortable with this situation. And so the GM notices, potentially their distress or their tap on the card, and the GM stops. The GM doesn't know why, he or she just brought this action to a stop. The GM is sitting there and just trying to figure out, well, what am I supposed to do? So let's bring it on there, because right now the GM and the other players are just sitting there and wondering, all right, how come everything is stopped? So the default is that you don't have to and aren't going to talk about it. There's a problem with that. There may not be a reason why you're not consenting. So the player themselves might not even fully understand. And yes, there could be something that is just suddenly comes up in their emotional state or in their mind that they, I can't go forward with this and I really can't explain why. But if they're not going to even say that, then everyone is just sitting there, in an awkward moment, not knowing what's going on. Nobody is owed an explanation to the game group about it. The person refusing to consent is not responsible for making the group understand why the topic is a problem. Actually, I skipped around a little bit, so I have to remember left side, right side here. It is not up for debate. It's inappropriate and unfair for anyone else in the game to pressure, persuade, bribe, or influence someone to change their mind about a consent topic. The group shouldn't outvote them and make them accept the topic they're not comfortable with. And I agree with that. What the person should do is step away from the game. The point of gaming is to have fun, and nobody should try to convince them to do something that they don't think will be fun. You know what? There are so many things that happen in an RPG, from rolling a critical failure to your character dying to getting stopped by a mental puzzle that no one in your character group, no one in your player group, I mean, can sit there and can figure it out. And there's times when the GM is sitting there and they planned out this whole thing in their head, and they're excited about it, and the players just take it into a different direction. And I can tell you that losing a character or getting a whole string of bad rolls, or any number of things, having planned out this scenario and having the players completely circumvent it somehow, none of that is fun. Now, as a whole experience, that becomes a little blip, hopefully. But, for the most part, it is not action-packed fun and, fun and great times from start to finish through a playing session. They can always change their mind about what they are or aren't consenting to. If a person thought they'd be fine with the topic and later turns out that they aren't fine with the topic, it's all right for them to let the people know this, at which point the topic should be removed from the game. That's a big problem. And the reason why that's a big problem is that now the GM and the rest of the players have all come together, including that player, and they submitted their consent forms, and the GM has gone over this. And this is assuming that the GM had all of this time in a session zero to look through and to say, all right, we've got all these things. I've gotten what your thumbs up are. I know what your no-goes are, and I'm going to write an adventure that is going to avoid your no-goes and hit on a couple of your thumbs ups. And now we're going to start this adventure, and everybody's doing, fine. And then there's a key point in the adventure that the DM is just really stoked about, and the other players are starting to they're getting ready to jump in this thing. And I've had combat situations, I've had other story elements in an adventure kind of built up like this, and then all of a sudden one player decides or just realizes, or for whatever reason they say, no, you know what, I know we didn't talk about this earlier, but I have a problem with this. Or all they do is they touch their X card and no explanation whatsoever. And now, at which point the topic should be removed from the game. That is just beyond beyond understanding that this would be the choice of a resolution of that coming from this document. I mean, it completely removes the fun of everyone else. It disregards the fun of everyone else. All right. This is probably one of the most selfish things, resolutions I've ever heard. All right. And seriously, I debated whether or not to entitle this, by putting a line through, consent in gaming, and made it selfishness in gaming just from that one line alone. Because this is someone who is putting, even if it's their comfort, ahead of everybody else's fun, when this is supposed to be a social experience. This is supposed to be an experience removed from their real life, situations. It's supposed to be, they're supposed to be that cushion. I will go all the way back to this beginning here, and right here, playing an RPG is a shared experience that is supposed to be fun for everyone involved, and part of what's making sure that everybody in the game is consented to the premise and expectations of the campaign and genre. That's happening in the beginning, that characters are going to be in life and death situations, emotional conflicts and intensities with other people, and traumatic or unhealthy environments, things you might avoid and deflect from if it were actually happening to you in real life. None of this is supposed to be connecting to your real life experiences. And the GM and the other players have already made steps to ensure that that doesn't happen. So when it gets removed from the game, it takes away from everybody else. Remove yourself from that gaming session, and then ask when you come back later, because I'm not saying, oh, you're done. Unless, of course, it's a tournament play, or a convention play, or a one time a pug, where you're only coming together for this one time, a 4-hour session or a 3-hour session. Then fine, your character is gone. The player steps away, and the the GM will take that character as an NPC and continue running without that person. Anyone is allowed to leave an uncomfortable situation at any time, and I agree. But that's the right response to take place. All right. If a problematic situation comes up and someone doesn't feel like continuing the game, it is all right if they step out. And that is the response. Not removing that portion from the game that everyone was either aware of or no one was aware that it was going to be a problem, but now it suddenly is. That person has the right to just step out. I think it's a far better resolution of the problem than to alter everything else, to alter everyone else's fun. Going on down, the X card. So, an X card, if you're not familiar with it, an X card is a game tool usable in any game where someone at the table can silently signal that whatever is happening or being discussed is making them uncomfortable. If a player uses an X card, the GM or whoever is acting when the card is activated should either revise the current content to avoid the problem content or skip ahead so that the problem content is no longer present. Once again, if no one knows what the issue is when the person taps the card, the GM or whomever is not going to have any idea what content they're supposed to skip over. However, the player might not want to share or elaborate, and it's best to respect that they are willing to discuss and what they might simply want to leave in the past. So again, how do you know what to skip? How do you know what to omit the next time that you're playing if there is no discussion about what the issue was? The group's responsibility to remember and uphold the decisions and changes that were made. Kind of hard to do if you don't know why you were being asked to skip over something. I'm going to try to cut my sarcasm down a little bit. But you can see that these are issues that keep on coming up with this. And it just doesn't make sense that when they wrote this, they weren't thinking of anyone else but that one individual. They weren't thinking, well, what's a problem that could arise by looking at this? And they just don't. I've read this thing like 3 or 4 times now, and then went through the issue of, highlighting certain areas that I wanted to make key points on. They just don't cover that. And that's a glaring omission that they're not dealing with that problem with this. Recovering from consent mistakes. No matter how careful everyone is about consent, someone might make a mistake and introduce a topic that isn't on the opt-in list. They might also make a mistake in not introducing the topic that was on the opt-out list as well. Again, it keeps on putting the onus on everyone else but the player that is having an issue. All right. The person who made the error should apologize to the group, including the player that forgot to mention something that was a problem for them. Some people find it hard to apologize because people in general are discouraged from admitting they're wrong. I agree, people, don't like to admit when they're wrong. Everyone in the group should agree to be more careful about it. That keeps the person who is apologizing from being singled out and reminds everyone that dealing with consent is everyone's responsibility. All right, including the player who is withdrawing consent without having prior discussions about what they were comfortable with and what they were not comfortable with. It's possible to recover from an error, keep playing, and get back to the excitement and the teamwork of playing an RPG. That's, of course, if you didn't have to skip over a major part of the gaming session, and then it becomes virtually impossible to continue running that particular adventure because the continuity of the story has been totally excised from the DM's plans and from just the momentum of the gameplay, and the GM might actually have to step away and come up with something else. And then if they do come up with something else, do they have to run through the whole process of, well, hey, will this be a problem for anybody if we go forward? Totally destroys the gaming flow if they have to go back and retool something like that. Be aware of bleed. Bleed occurs when the emotions of a character affect the emotions of the player and vice versa. There's nothing wrong with bleed. All right. Again, we go back to the very beginning when we're talking about not tying what is happening to your character with what is happening to you or vice versa. All right. Bleed is occurring when someone is putting too much into this game session. They're just they're investing way too much, especially if this is a 2 hour or a 4 hour one shot that they're playing. There should be no bleed, occurring when you're playing a convention play or a store play with a whole bunch of new players, or if it's a pickup group on an online, Google Hangouts or Roll D20 gaming session, and you're running a one shot. No bleed should be taking place. All right. You should not be that connected to your characters because you can, even if it's a character you brought to the table, that game session doesn't have to exist for your character at any other time. You take your character home and you use your character in their normal regular campaign anyway. So plan theme. So I'm going to the consent checklist now. So they're starting to prep us on what's going to be in a consent checklist. The plan theme, a place for the GM to give a quick summary of the game so players can immediately know if they'd be interested in participating in it. All right, that's the first step. I completely agree with that. I don't think that it should be a quick summary. I think it should be detailed. It should talk about this is the title of the adventure. This is the game system. This is the game rule set that I'm using, whether it's a homebrew or what rules I'm leaving out, what rules I'm adding in. It should be, give it a general rating. All right, this is going to be a PG-13 game. These are some of the themes that I'm going to be using. The main theme of the adventure is going to be this. This is possibly the most controversial thing that you'll see. All right, that should be front loaded to the players. And then I would add on this, on this consent form or on this informational piece that I'm handing to the players, is that, by choosing to sit at this table, you are consenting to this basic structure. Then if the GM goes outside of that basic structure, then you could say, hey, you know what? You're not following the thing that you said you were going to follow. All right. And then if the players are be like, oh wait, suddenly I have a problem with zombies and we're running a mission, an adventure against the undead. Well, that's a ridiculous demand to make. We can't skip over that. We're not going to skip over that. All right. You know, this is your responsibility as a player coming in. that, you agreed to this up front. You made a promise to everybody else, basically, that you were going to go through this session, barring any real type of emergency, and you're going to, you're going to follow through on this. All right. Or you can opt and walk away, and we can move on with four players and a GM, and we can, run your PC as an NPC now. That's not a problem. A GM, if they're properly prepared for this, should have a an NPC or two that can just fit it, fill in this slot if necessary. The moving rating, I agree with, and I mentioned the concept, the consent topics. That yes, they should be explicit and open for clarification, and the players should be asking, what is it that, what is it that I can expect, or they can say at that time, listen, I'm not willing to see this. If this is going to be a major part of this adventure, I'm not going to sit down at this table. And they go through opt in and opt out. Once the GM knows what topics the group has agreed to, they can account for those things appearing in the game. Yes, if the GM knows all of the things, and that requires the players to tell them what we would like to see, what we absolutely don't want to see, and then the GM can start to tailor an adventure to meet that. But if it's not a usual get together with your players, the GM is not going to have that time. The GM is going to just have a very quick questionnaire, a very quick informational piece to give out to the players, and then the players are the ones that have to decide if they are going to sit down to that gaming session. It then goes through the consent checklist, and again, I like these, the GM's name, the player's name, that doesn't necessarily be on, need to be on here. The planned game themes, the movie rating. The players can check off on these things if they wish. Actually, I would prefer that instead of the players checking off on these things, I think it's a much more concise list if the GM is generating a list of elements that are going to be in the game, and the players can then decide from there. As long as the GM is not introducing anything additional than what the players are being presented on this list, then there shouldn't be a problem that arises. If the GM is introducing something that wasn't mentioned, then that is something where the GM has not done a very good job at prepping his or her game and explaining this is what you can expect in this, in this circumstance. So that is essentially my run through here. Let me switch screens. So my review of consent in gaming, I mean, I have many problems with this. I believe that they probably, you know, I firmly believe that what their intent was to make something that is going to make players feel comfortable playing at a gaming table that they might not be familiar with. And I think that their intention was that GMs will now have the opportunity to look at these things and to avoid those various triggering events that the players might experience. Where I think it really does fall short is that it's very one-sided. It's very, and when one-sided is one thing, player and GM one-sidedness this really could come down to just one player out of the five that are sitting at the table, or the six if you include the GM that are sitting at the table. And, unless you're in a very small group, that one player, is it's their right to just walk away, and it might actually be the best situation for everybody at the table if that player does walk away, because now the game can continue, especially if it's under the time constraints of a 4 hour convention setting, or a setting where you went to a local gaming store, usually a comic book store, and you've reserved a table for 4 hours for $10. And, the last thing you need is somebody who is going to hang up the story, because they didn't mention or didn't know that they were going to have an issue with the story that you're telling, and then, basically derail, the entire gaming experience for everybody involved. So, I think that what they really need to do is add some more components to this and address some of the issues that that I have brought up, and others have brought up, and not be so, because I've read many of their, you know Monte Cook Games responses on Facebook, where it's basically, well, we're really not telling you what to do, but they are, you know, and others are going to take this as, this is the way it is. If you accept it, that's fantastic. If you don't accept it, well, then you're being a bad faith actor in this, and you're the reason why this exists, is because you don't accept it as gospel, and you're just going to run with this, and any pushback on this is negative, and you need to leave the table. You shouldn't be a GM if you're looking at this and saying, hey, this is not how I want to, you know that's not how I want to play the game. It's not even about, this is not how I want to run a table, or this is not how I want to run an adventure. This is not how I want to game, where one individual can say nothing else matters but what I want. So that's the problem that I see with this, is that it really does need to be tweaked, quite a bit, I think, in order to address some of those situations. And in convention play, I can definitely see someone filling out one of these things and then just trolling that table and coming out and just tapping on that X card just to bring everything to the stop, just for the heck of it. Because we all know that there are people out there that are going to be asshats with this. And that's another thing that consent in gaming does not address. What is the GM's response? What is the rest of the players' response if they have somebody who is just trying to be a troll and a spoiler for everyone else? Because, if you don't believe that happens, you've never played a massively multiplayer online video game before. You've never done a dungeon run in multiplayer games before. There are people that just exist to, piss in your Cheerios, and that will happen on a convention floor. I guarantee that someone will take this stupid thing in their hand. I don't mean to say stupid, I'm sorry, but take this thing in the hand and go to a table and say, "Oh, look, I'm cued in on this thing," and they fill out their checklist, and then they just mess with you the whole time. So, once again, I apologize for a few side remarks and stuff like that, but it really is something that I think is quite frankly half baked, and it needs some more work to be done on it. So once again, thanks for joining. If you like the video, give it a thumbs up. If you want to leave a comment, please, go right ahead, leave a comment, positive, negative, if you did totally disagree with me, put it out there and actually look at the sections that I went over, and you show me or explain to me how my thinking on those particular sections that I pointed to, that how you think I was completely wrong, and this is how I should have seen them. So don't just come up and say, "Oh, you know what? You're an idiot. You don't know what you're talking about." I went point by point based on what I read and what I interpreted. So if you're going to counteract, counterclaim what I was seeing, do the same thing. Actually go and look at it and say, "Hey, look at this section. This is where I think you're wrong." So let's do this intelligently, and if you can convince me, because I can be convinced that I am wrong. All right. If you can convince me that I'm wrong on a particular subject, then, that's fantastic. I hope that Monte Cook Games takes a look at this video and they feel, inclined to answer to it, and look at some of the things that I pointed out and say, well, you know what? This is what we were thinking with. We still think that you're wrong. This is why we think you're wrong. So, I welcome the challenge for someone to come up with a counterpoint. Thank you for joining. You'll have a great week coming up. It's now Sunday. So you'll have a great week coming up. I look forward to seeing you on a gaming screen sometime soon. Have a good evening.